more than one small country. It is a big idea, a new world order, where diverse nations are drawn together in common cause to achieve the universal aspirations of mankind: peace and security, freedom, and the rule of law.
New world days and new world nights, new world wrong and new world right, putting new world funds in the new world banks, with the new world guns on the new world tanks, new world devils and new world gods, new world jams, even new world's hard, new world names sing new world songs, new world planes on the new world walls, new world flying, the new world's dying, the new world's flying, the new world's trying, new world's sun, the new world's stars, they've already started us new world order, new world people, the new world to bang, new world streets for the new world to hang, new world president, new world drugs, new world resident, new world thugs, new world players for new world sports, new world trial, new world courts, new world warriors and new world laws, new world prisons and new world bars, new world fight for new world fist, new world lighting up and new world flip.
Yes, baby. You're listening to 91.7 KOOP. This is Gabo, Guerra, your host, coming at you live atop the Historic Fifth Street Studio. We're going to have a very special show for you tonight. I have Scott Horton from the weekendinterviewshow.com, and we're going to discuss the nature of the corporation, the nature of libertarianism, anarcho-libertarianism, and some other libertarian socialism, and we're going to compare and contrast that. But first thing I got to let y'all know is, and I'll take this call, the first call at 702. First call at 472-KOOP will get The Smartest Guys in the Room, which is a documentary of Enron. And the number for that is 472-KOOP, and we got 2 tickets for you at the Dolby Theater. And I'll quickly remind you of that to call, but I just want to let y'all know, first person to call after we're done, we'll get the tickets. So be the first to call. Not right now, but at 7:32, so you could be the first one to call, because we want to get right into the stuff, into our program here. The first thing I have to do is let you know that the views and opinions expressed here on the Liberated Space are solely those of me, the producer, and any guests I might have. Any material I might play is in USC Codes 70 Fair Use Provision. So we're doing this in order to express our views as individuals, and because of that, anything said here is not those of Co-op's board of directors, studio staff, or anybody else. They're only mine and Scott's. I love saying that. Don't you love saying that, Scott, on mic too? What's going on there? Are you ready for another info session here, Scott?
Sure.
Okay, I'm gonna start this game off, and I'm gonna talk about libertarian socialism, and then I'm gonna ask you for your comments, and while you're telling me your comments, then we're gonna play what the leading libertarian socialism, Noam Chomsky, says, and a couple of interviews that's on public record. First of all, I'd like to say that the libertarian, or sometimes called anarcho-capitalist movement, was a reaction from the political right wing against U.S. President FDR's sweeping social democratic laws, passed as a response to a powerful labor movement in the 1930s. Unlike right-wing libertarians, liberals and social democrats, libertarian socialists reject participation in the mainstream repressive voting process. Libertarian socialism is, in effect, a revolutionary theory and approach to political life. Libertarian socialism's anti-state stance might even give it the label laissez-faire socialism. Libertarian socialism is any one of a group of political philosophies dedicated to opposing coercive forms of authority and social hierarchy, in particular, the institutions of capitalism in the state. Some of the best-known libertarian social ideologies are anarchism, particularly anarcho-communism and anarcho-syndicalism, council communism, autonomous Marxism. Libertarian socialists believe in the abolition of privately held means of production and the abolition of the state as unnecessary and harmful institutions. Now, that's the party line on what libertarian social is, and I'd like to get your feelings on what constitutes libertarian socialism as you understand it there, Scott.
Well, that sounded like a pretty good explanation of... basically, you have people on the left who get over Karl Marx and understand that rather than having overthrow and a dictatorship of the proletariat to set up everything wonderfully or some garbage like that, that it's best to focus on repeal and decentralization. And in their mind, I guess, I can't really speak for libertarian socialists, but best I understand, they want, as you said, to have a society where all property is held in common and there's no state. Now, to me, that sounds contradictory. I don't think that you can have, Obviously, you can have both to a degree, but I don't think you can have a society where there's no state and no private property, because obviously goods and services and things have to be exchanged among people, and there's got to be a way to do that. Private property, from a libertarian capitalist point of view, is the natural way, basically, of humanity, that in absence of a state, that we all do own property, and we can identify what our property is, and if we occupy land and mix our labor with it, like John Locke said, it becomes our property, and we can exchange it however we want. And so the ideas aren't necessarily contradictory. I mean, after all, if libertarian socialists want to own some property communally and all their behaviors are voluntary association, then there's no problem with it. It's the only problem if they want to export their syndicalist thing and force it on everybody else, which would make it communism in government. But
yeah, it violate the the non-aggression truce, and you can't use the force of government to do that. But it's important that we know that we do have a libertarian socialist virtually with us in the studio, and that would be Noam Chomsky, linguist, political philosopher, and we're going to have what Mr. Chomsky has to say, and we're going to springboard the discussion after that. So what's going on, Mr. Chomsky?
That's a very sharp attack on classical liberalism, in which rights are inherent in people of flesh and blood, not corporate entities like states or something like that. In fact, it's kind of this grew out of a kind of neo-Hegelian concepts of the rights of organic entities over individuals. Actually had three major outgrowths in the 20th century. One is fascism, another's Bolshevism, and another's corporatism. They're rather similar in their character and the reasoning behind them.
Well, I would agree with that.
Oh, was that the whole clip?
No, that was just the first part, but I wanted to get your feeling in it before we go to the second one. It's going to be another short one.
Well, I think that's a very interesting point that he raises, the Hegelian nature, that really Friedrich Hegel supposedly imagined himself expanding on John Locke, but what he really did was he turned liberalism from individualism into kind of a anti-church collectivism, basically. And as he said, fascism and communism and corporatism are all collectivist structures that form from the original Hegelian collectivist mindset. As he said, the organism, quote unquote, which is obviously purely the imagination of whatever individual is pretending to behold it, but the organism outweighs the right of the individual. And so, therefore, your freedom is your right to do what I tell you, basically.
That's right, and it's important to know that libertarian socialism is anti-authoritarian form of socialism, and the main principles are liberty, freedom, and the right of workers to fraternize and organize democratically, the absence of illegitimate authority, and resistance against force. We're going to go back to Noam and get some more points here, and then Scott's going to come back and give us some more of his illuminations. You got to love Noam.
What we need is not more intrusive government. We need more demanding consumers.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like Chomsky to me.
Who develop a market-like mechanism.
Yeah, it's the whole point that we'll let the consumers. I think the point he was going to say is that the consumers. I recently saw an example of that with Nike. In terms of Nike's, now Nike's actually treating their workers like humans because the people have demanded that Nike actually provide some good working conditions.
Of course, that's true. It's nothing the government did. It's because they got a bunch of bad publicity. And people stopped buying their shoes and people stopped buying their stock. And they realized that it's better to go ahead and invest more in labor and keep good PR than it is to save money on labor and look like the devil. And it became news, really, because the word Nike became, in Vietnam, it became a word for, like, I'm going to beat you up. Like, you're about to get Nike'd, because the bosses at the factory would hit the kids over the head with the shoes if they talked or wanted to go to the bathroom or disobeyed whatever rules. And Nike became a slang for, violence. And that reflected really bad. And I think, I can't really speak for Chomsky, but I think that he would say that that's an example of markets doing what they're supposed to do, but he would probably correctly assert that that is not the typical case. Because the typical case of the giant conglomerate, the giant corporation, is that they're in bed with the politicians, and they have the state to force the taxpayer to help keep those companies in a safe place. So they have the profit interest of private property and capitalism, but they don't have to deal with the risk factor involved because they have the state there to back them up. Nike is an exception to that rule.
Very sharply condemned by conservatives. It's a breed of people that doesn't exist anymore, but they did at that time. Conservative meant classical liberal. They were condemned as a kind of a reversion to feudalism, or even as a form of communism, which was not unreasonable. If by communism you mean Bolshevism, yeah, it was rather similar in conception. And the same by their advocates, like, say, progressives like Woodrow Wilson, who was a big proponent of corporatization, nevertheless pointed out correctly that this is the end of freedom. It's the end of private enterprise. It's the end of freedom. It's a new America in which people will not be working for themselves, but will be servants of corporate entities.
That's right. I think with this increase in globalization now, it seems that we have the forces of libertarians, and we also have your socialists, and we're all fighting the anti-authoritarian nature of globalized capitalism. And when I hear the fallacy of free markets, it just kind of gets my blood boiling, particularly when you have people, good organizations like the Cato Institute, which I agree with most of the stuff they say. Then they come out with crony capitalism and they shill for that. Now, what are your insights into that, Scott?
Well, a lot of this is really confusing and multifaceted stuff that goes quite a way back. When he refers to the progressive era under Woodrow Wilson as being the end of private enterprise, he's exactly right, because this is when basically the liberals, the little L liberal, rank and file throughout the country, they abandoned individualism and laissez-faire, and they began to believe instead that they need to get the state to work for them to protect them from the richest of the capitalists. Well, the problem was it was the state that had protected and made the richest of the capitalists as rich as they were in the first place, and all the progressive regulatory and welfare states was really the idea of the people with the power on Wall Street. The free market was beginning to, and Chomsky has noted this many times, also the work of Gabriel Kolko, The Triumph of Conservatism, has explained this in great detail, how basically all the left-wingers out in the street chanting for more government regulation and protection and whatever, they were really all the dupes of the people with the power on the East Coast whose their profits were, they had new competition in California and Texas and the Midwest. There was all sorts of new capital rising up in America, and the old Eastern establishment was in a hurry to consolidate what power they had and to keep it permanent. And to that end, they created the progressive movement. And it's no coincidence that the progressive movement was led by people like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, who was J.P. Morgan's man. That was the bankers who pulled off the whole scam.
And the result of that is now we don't have any companies in America that are, making T-shirts or making television sets.
Well, who wants to make T-shirts or television sets? The thing is this. Here's what you got to understand as a basic principle. Well, you don't have to believe it or accept it, but understand that the basic principle of free market economics is that if it's supposed to be this way, it's going to naturally work out. And if it's a mistake, it's going to naturally turn itself back over. In fact, Lew Rockwell wrote a great piece. He's the president of the Ludwig von Mises Institute. And he wrote a great piece that was up there yesterday called What Made the Next Depression Worse? He brings up the dot-com boom and how everybody blames the dot-com boom on the rapid progress of technology created this boom and then it busted. But that's actually not the case.
It was greed.
It was national government intervention in the economy. It was Alan Greenspan and him using police power to keep the interest rates artificially low and to create brand new money out of nothing that all went to the stock market bubble. But people don't understand that it's the government intervention that defying the laws of economics sets them up for a worse crisis later on. And then when the worst crisis comes later on, they demand more government to solve the problem that government caused in the first place. That's exactly what happened with the Great Depression and the New Deal, which was actually begun by Herbert Hoover. People say what a pro-capitalist, laissez-faire guy he was. He sure was pro-capitalist, but he sure wasn't laissez-faire. He began the New Deal, and Franklin Roosevelt in 1933 ran on a small government Jacksonian Democrat laissez-faire platform against the big government liberal Republican from the Northeast, Herbert Hoover. And of course, as soon as FDR seized power, he declared a national emergency against the economy and treated it as such, treated it as an enemy, and did everything he could to nationalize every bit of it that he could get away with. And it was all in the interest of the people who had the power and the money and had, through their Federal Reserve System, caused the Great Depression in the first place. And they're terrorists, too.
Oh, yeah. And another point from a well-known progressive is Howard Zinn.
Labor struggles in American history. And, there are two very important organizations which devote themselves to fighting the power of the corporation, which is greater at this point than any other point. And those two organizations are one, the Socialist Party, which is very powerful, has 2 million readers of its newspapers all over the country, has 35 locals in Oklahoma, and elects socialists to legislatures, even to Congress. And Socialist Party is one of those groups. And the other is the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, which sets up in 1905 a radical labor organization, one big union, no craft unions like the AFL, and all workers who work in one establishment join one union and fight the employers, not just for improved wages and conditions, but eventually take over the economy, take over the corporation. I mean, they're serious, the IWW. Anyway, with these two organizations in support, workers all over the country go on strike in various ways.
Sorry to put y'all through that, fellow libertarians. What do you think of Howard Zinn's comments there? Is it typical?
Honestly, Gabo, I slept through most of it. I really don't care for Howard Zinn.
Well,
the fact of the matter is, do free people have the right to associate and say they're not going to sell their labor for less than this much? Okay, yeah. So what took 10 minutes to say that?
Oh,
Howard Zinn is an idiot, dude. Howard Zinn is nothing but a red. And, he talks about, you heard him, take over the economy! Take over that corporation. He doesn't believe in liberty. What he believes is his liberty, it means people like him get to take stuff away from you. And that's what makes them free, he thinks. And if you read his book, The People's History, there's some interesting facts of history and stuff in there, but it's just pure red Bolshevism. I don't know why anybody wastes their time with Zinn, man. He's a waste of time.
Well, here's his poignant point. I was going to bring that up. And then
was there a poignant point?
No, this is, apparently he says there's going to be a backlash to the future. Let's just hear it.
Which might turn out to happen 50 years from now, is that there actually might have developed, out of the first stirrings in the year 2000 and 2001, there might have developed a powerful anti-corporate movement in the United States which would take down the power of the corporations and lift up the power of
it's the historical inevitability that we're all going to be reds like Howard Zinn.
Workers in the world unite.
That's so stupid. Hey, all you have to do is wait. I bet you that 45 years from now, what? I don't have anything else to say about that. That's stupid.
Well, that's the whole point. I want to get your
look, here's the thing. Corporations are creatures of the state.
Well, you talk about the battle in Seattle. What did you think about the popular uprising that happened in Seattle with the World Trade Organization and fighting corporate global fascism? What would you say to that?
You really want to know?
Yeah, I want to know. We still got a few minutes here, so rip it.
All right, here's the thing. It is my principle, I can't prove this, whatever, you can disagree with me if you like. It's my principle that any individual has the right to enter into any consensual arrangement with any other individual, assuming they're all over 18. And that includes capitalistic acts between consenting adults, no matter if they're in China or Russia or India or the United States or anywhere else. So all these left-wing communists who think that somehow a world government is going to protect them from the corporations. In fact, look, here's the thing. What happened in Seattle was a lot of, I mean, don't get me wrong, because I don't want to be too broad-brushed, because obviously it was tens of thousands of protesters, and they're all individuals, and they all have their own points of view. But in the wash, what came out in the end on TV, because this was the majority opinion, was that the WTO doesn't care about labor, and they don't care about the environment, and so that's why we don't like them. Well, what does that mean? That means that the WTO ought to care about labor and the environment, which means what? Regulate labor and the environment over the whole world. That is what the WTO is. It's not a void space where trade barriers cease to exist. It is a world federal government with regulatory power to decide trade disputes between sovereign nations. And all the left-wingers out in the street are chanting, they don't care about the poor girl tied to the sewing machine. And Bill Clinton went in there and gave a speech and said, you know, the hippies are right. We ought to listen to them. We ought to regulate labor. We ought to regulate trade. We ought to everything about it. We ought to regulate the environment. We ought to protect that poor little girl tied to the sewing machine in Indonesia somewhere. This is the responsibility of the WTO. We shouldn't shirk our responsibility. So these people, in their anti-corporatism, all they're doing is creating another federal government farther and farther away from any place where they have power.
Well, you're right, but these are the same people who go to Walmart to shop. On one hand, they complain about globalization, but they want those better deals and lower prices.
Right, and the fact of the matter is, low prices isn't necessarily a problem unless, I mean, if you know that people in prisons are making the products you're buying, then that's one thing. But assuming that the person in China who's producing whatever you're buying showed up on purpose and they're an adult and decided to be there, and you're saving money, that's fine. The real problem with Walmart is they're not free market at all. Walmart gets all kinds of government subsidies. And not only that, they use local governments to seize people's property, to turn it over to them.
It's corporate welfare.
And they work out, yeah, exactly. It's mercantilism. And remember, Gabo, that when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, he wasn't refuting socialism. It didn't exist yet. He was refuting mercantilism. He was refuting the system in Europe where the monarchs would grant exclusive monopoly charters to, say, for example, the British East India Company or such like that. And basically, it was nothing but a disaster because state power, of course, with tax money and police power, was defying the laws of economics. And Adam Smith was writing that if you just get government out and you let people go and invest and make their own tea company and sell their tea for a profit, whatever, it's going to work out.
But as long as you don't have the syndicate crony capitalism...
There you go. So this is what Adam Smith was refuting in the first place. And this was the kind of ideals that America was founded on, but quickly abandoned, as Chomsky has probably done a better job than anyone of explaining, that the rich people abandon laissez-faire immediately because they realize it's cheaper to buy a congressman than it is to continue researching and developing interesting things that people want to spend money on.
But Adam Smith also talked about a moral component of creating a good product and the virtue of creating a good product. There was also that totally went out the window.
Yeah, but that doesn't matter. It's still determined by market forces. If somebody produces a crappy product, how many people do you know that went out and bought a Ford Edsel recently? You know, everybody knows they suck, so they don't sell. You know, you buy a pair of shoes that aren't comfortable, you don't get the same kind next time.
Okay, in wrapping up here, I want as a possible answer, I want you to compare and contrast the minarchists versus the anarchists vis-a-vis libertarianism.
Well, there's all different brands of minarchists and anarchists. I think in fact, Rothbard wrote a great piece called Do You Hate the State that was featured on LouRockwell.com yesterday. And he said the question is not so much between minarchism and anarchism as it is a question between radicalism and conservatism. You can have a very radical minarchist and a very conservative anarchist, and it's the radical who really has liberty in his heart. That's where the good argument will lie. It's very interesting that in terms of left-right libertarianism, all of that completely breaks down because the so-called left libertarians, like you tend to find at Reason Magazine, tend to be more permissive toward war, whereas the paleo-libertarians and the paleo-conservative types are the most hardcore anti-war, as to be found at the Mises Institute or antiwar.com.
There you have it, folks. I hope we just raise more questions than provide you with answers.
Hey, can I plug my show Saturday?
Plug your show.
Saturday, I'm going to interview Justin Raimondo, the head writer at antiwar.com, and also Peter Lance, who knows everything that there is to know about Ramzi Youssef and all the terrorist guys.
All right, that's weekendinterviewshow.com and rbnlive.com streaming. All right, folks, Co-op now signs off. Co-op now includes this broadcast. Gay Co-op is community radio for Austin, Texas, and is licensed by the Board of Directors of Texas State Kingdom of the Federal Communications Commission. Co-op does business with Austin Co-op Radio and broadcasts 91.7 megahertz with an effective rating power of 3,000 watts. Power to the individual. And remember the Waco tank driver. And also remember the Alamo. This is Gabo signing off, y'all. And don't forget to call us for those tickets. We got a couple pair of tickets. Enron, the smartest guys in the room.
The number.
472-KOOP, 472-5667. First call, get these tickets. Call. Yeah, we got tickets. 472-KOOP. Hey, Enron, the smartest guys in the room. I don't know, some documentary, but call and get them.